Welcome to the future we need and how to get it. All over the world and right here on the Central Coast, people at all levels of society are stepping up to assure that we actually do have a future and one we can all live with. In this 7-part series, we tell the stories of their successes so far and what we can learn from them. As I've gone into these stories, been looking for patterns around what has made them successes. And I've discerned some 7 sources of social power. So in the series, we're exploring all 7 of those sources. The first 2 we looked at were changing the stories we tell ourselves, our beliefs, actual beliefs about what's possible. And the second was looking at the solutions that are emerging and how do we bring those to scale. And then we bump right up against the question of money. So tonight, we're talking about how can we do the least harm in how we make money and the most good in how we spend it, moving it to where its use has the biggest payoff in well-being for all affected by our choices. For functionally, that is what money comes down to, a universally accepted shorthand for quantifying much of what is at stake in the choices we make, and then making perfectly clear just which choices we are making now and even into the future, for that is what debt is, and investments are claims against our future. With this topic of money, we also return to our original 5 myths, beliefs that we have that disable our ability to act effectively as citizens in the world. Tonight, we're looking at the belief that we just don't have the money we need. Even if we can find solutions to our problems, as we talked about last time, it would cost more than we have to bring them to scale. Miss Piggy famously said years ago in her world-renowned guide to successful budgeting, if you want to manage your money better, the first thing you have to have is money to manage. And we do. We have more money than we know what to do with. Just check this out. Wipe out all student loan debt of $1.3 trillion if we did that instead of buying 2,400 jets that together cost $1.43 trillion and have money left over to pay off some personal credit debt as well. In fact, right now, the total world budget on armaments in 2016 was $1.686 trillion. And this year, our budget just in the U.S. alone is $825. Our California revenue for taxes is $122 billion. The question is, where's that money coming from? Where's it going? And how do we affect that? That's the focus of this month's show. It turns out that the money comes from and through different places, and not just thinking in terms of politics narrowly, but looking at the whole range of ways we can influence things. Businesses that make money solving problems instead of making more problems. Investors who make returns on investing to such business and refuse or divest from companies that cause harm in their products or in their processes. Professionals who take the lead in educating and demanding of their colleagues and those we serve better ways of doing things, and as taxpayers insist on taking back our public money and putting it to public good through public banks. All of these are approaches right now. What's of particular interest is that we have a whole generation of young entrepreneurs coming of age, people who grew up knowing that if they're even going to have a world to live in, let alone a future, they're going to have to somehow clean up the messes that the parents have left behind. Here is an example of one such young man, an Englishman, Toby Eccles, who has come up with a great way to combine purpose and profit.
And if we can agree both a value and a way of measuring whether we've been successful at reducing that reoffending, then we can do something we think rather interesting. The idea is called the social impact bond. Now, the social impact bond is simply saying, if we can get government to agree that, we can create a contract where they only pay if it worked. So that means that they can try out new stuff without the embarrassment of having to pay if it didn't work, which for still quite a lot of bits of government, that's a serious issue. Now, many of you may have noticed there's a problem at this point, and that is that it takes a long time to measure whether those outcomes have happened. So, we have to raise some money. We use the contract to raise money from socially motivated investors. Socially motivated investors. There's an interesting idea, right? But actually, there's a lot of people who, if they're given the chance, would love to invest in something that does social good. And here's the opportunity. Do you want to also help government find whether there's a better economic model? Not just leaving these guys to come out of prison and waiting till they reoffend and putting them back in again, but actually working with them to move to a different path, to end up with fewer crimes and fewer victims. So we find some investors, and they pay for a set of services. And if those services are successful, then they improve outcomes. And with those measured reductions in reoffending, government saves money. And with those savings, they can pay outcomes. And the investors not just get their money back, but they make a return. So in March 2010, we signed the first social impact bond with the Ministry of Justice around Peterborough Prison. It was to work with 3,000 offenders, split into 3 cohorts of 1,000 each. Now, each of those cohorts would get measured over the 2 years that they were coming out of prison. They've got to have a year to commit their crimes, 6 months to get through the court system, and then they would be compared to a group taken from the police national computer, as similar as possible, and we would get paid, providing we achieved a hurdle rate of 10% reduction, for every conviction event that didn't happen. So we get paid for crime saved. Now, if we achieved that 10% reduction across all 3 cohorts, then the investors get a 7.5% annualized return on their investment. And if we do better than that, they can get up to 13% annualized return on their investment, which is okay. So, everyone wins here, right? The Ministry of Justice can try out a new program, and they only pay if it works. Investors get 2 opportunities. For the first time, they can invest in social change. Also, they make a reasonable return. And they also know that, okay, first investors in these kinds of things, they're going to have to be believers. They're going to have to care in the social program. But if this builds a track record over 5 or 10 years, then you can widen that investor community as more people have confidence in the product. The service providers, well, for the first time, they've got an opportunity to provide services and grow the evidence for what they're doing in a really constructive way and learn and demonstrate the value of what they're doing over 5 or 6 years, not just 1 or 2, as often happens at the moment. Society wins, fewer crimes, fewer victims. Now, the offenders, they also benefit. Instead of just coming out of the prison with £46 in their pocket, half of them not knowing where they're spending their first night out of jail, actually, someone meets them in prison, learns about their issues, meets them at the gate, takes them through to somewhere to stay, connects them to benefits, connects them to employment, drug rehabilitation, mental health, whatever's needed. There are now 13 social impact bonds in Britain, and amazing levels of interest in this idea all over the world. So David Cameron's put £20 million into a social outcomes fund to support this idea. Obama has suggested $300 million in the US budget for these kinds of ideas and structures to move it forward. And a lot of other countries are demonstrating considerable interest. So what's caused this excitement? Why is this so different for people? Well, the first piece, which we've talked about, is innovation. It enables testing of new ideas in a way that's less difficult for everybody. The second piece it brings is rigor. By working to outcomes, People really have to test and bring data into the situation that one's dealing with. So, taking Peterborough as an example, we add case management across all of the different organizations that we're working with, so they know what actually has been done with different prisoners, and at the same time, they learn from the Ministry of Justice, and we learn, because we pushed for the data, what actually happens, whether they get rearrested or not. And we learn and adapt the program accordingly. And this leads to the third element, which is new, and that's flexibility. Because normal contracting for things, when you're spending government money, you're spending our money, tax money, and the people who are in charge of that are very aware of it. So the temptation is to control exactly how you spend it. Now, any entrepreneur in the room knows that version 1.0 of the business plan is not the one that generally works. So when you're trying to do something like this, you need the flexibility to adapt the program. And again, in Peterborough, we started off with a program, but we also collected data, and over the period of time, we nuanced and changed that program to add a range of other elements so that the service adapts and we meet the needs of the long term as well as the short term. Greater engagement from the prisoners, longer term engagement as well. The last element is partnership. There is a moment of stale debate going on very often. State's better, public sector's better, private sector's better, social sector's better for a lot of these programs. Actually, for creating social change, we need to bring in the expertise from all of those parties in order to make this work.
Some of the questions that can be raised about what happens with what he's calling social impact bonds is whether this is a way of turning human values, human caring, just into money. Or is this another kind of privatization? Well, in our show last month, we had another example similar to what he's doing, where nurses worked with families, and it ended up saving so much money in costs of dropouts, criminal juveniles, and domestic violence that it was well worth it to the County of Santa Cruz to try this out, because what we're paying for in a social impact bond, we're not paying for a service, we're paying for the impact. We don't pay until it's actually reduced our public money, and we take no risk. The question then is, well, okay, if this is all going to be funded by public money, where's that money going to come from? Well, right now, we have $122 billion in revenues in 2017 in California. We have $600 billion in our state retirement accounts, one of the largest investors in the world. We have $5 billion estimated revenues for marijuana coming into California that's unbanked. Put all that money together along with savings that we're not even allowed to spend and make that the basis of putting out loans, we would have about $1.25 trillion available each year to loan out for startups, to turn green industries around, to take the lead around the world in new ways of saving our oceans, ways of restoring the soils, changing how we do farming, as well as dramatically reduce student debt, deal with our housing problems, all of the things that are the problems we're up against. And in fact, around the country in the US, 23 states and municipalities, 4 or 5 of the largest cities in California are now looking at doing exactly that, including in particular here in Santa Cruz. We're looking at creating a public bank, the County Bank of Santa Cruz. In the second half of the show tonight, we will have a guest in who's one of the leaders in the citizen leaders here in town in that area, and have a chance to go in depth on that area and what you can do about it. Right now, we as citizens of California have all this money sitting in commercial banks gathering little interest. Meanwhile, these banks, when we go to build a highway, repair a bridge, or get ready for the next fire or disaster, and we have to go for loans, we're borrowing it from commercial banks, and it costs for $1 billion that we spend to actually do the job that is needed, we spend another $1 billion that just goes off to commercial banks elsewhere, who then turn around and fund fuels, carbon fuels, and go into the Monte Carlo investing, what's called investing still, but in fact is playing games with money. It's not serving our public good at all. Instead, we could build roads, shore up our bridges, build schools, libraries, even start converting our own infrastructure to new renewable technologies. Well, right now what we do is we go back to the same banks and borrow back, in effect, our own money that we put in for taxes and then put into commercial banks, and then turn around and pay them for the privilege of borrowing back our own money. And by the time we're done, as I said, we have wasted twice as much money as it would have cost us to do the job in the first place. Now imagine that we citizens and taxpayers were instead bringing in the dividends from all of this and putting them to work to pay for real solutions to our problems. We can actually buy the services of a Tony Eccles. We can be encouraging startups of young people throughout California to basically paying them to solve problems rather than make problems, and reaching out to other parts of the US. The solutions that we've talked about in recent shows, Learning to Learn, ways of ensuring success in school that are virtually guaranteed. We can take this kind of investing in guaranteed outcomes, turn it into public services, and literally start creating a livable future. Look at our next video, in which we shift from talking about public money to private equity, because as it happens, there is a major move, trillions of dollars around the world, in which there's more and more interest in putting even private equity money into solving problems.
Je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
What I was especially impressed by with this video is among the new partners in this program that would take in which 225 of the leading companies in the world have agreed that they are going to influence the 100 companies, largest multinationals that are still heavily invested in fossil fuels. One of them is the CalPERS. I've mentioned that earlier. My retirement system. Betty Yee, a board member of CalPERS, is one of the signers to the Global Investor Statement on Climate Change. And that means I can quit feeling guilty about the money I get in my retirement each month. Because it's easy for us to think in terms of fat bankers off somewhere, but in reality, I'm one of the people right here who's benefiting from that money that has been invested in the wrong things. And now we have a chance to turn that around. University and government monies, retirement accounts everywhere. The massive movement to divest from not only fossil fuels, but poisoning of our soil, prisons, armaments, start turning our money into solving all the good things we could be doing with it, now become an option because the companies, major multinationals themselves, are realizing that's the business of the future. That's where the money is going to be made. And they're actually helping each other get out of that business. One of the people who's a leader in this, Jean Bavaria, starting in the late 80s, took us into this visioning and brought top Fortune 500 companies with her over the last 40-year period. One of the things that the Ceres Foundation that she put together has done is they have the 21st century roadmap for sustainability. And they have a lot of money to spend. They do extraordinarily sophisticated education for top business leaders, making the business case, as well as giving them the tools they need for the accountability, the data, transparency. And there are 4 or 5 organizations that have banded together around the world to promote these standards as part of the United Nations standards for socially responsible investment that is driving the whole thing. And guess what? These are the stocks that make the most money. This isn't just being good. This is being good and doing well, both. That's our future. And the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, increasing transparency, makes markets more efficient and economies more stable and resilient. Ironically, there is a convergence here between what society needs, what the planet needs, and what makes durable profit over the long haul, the triple bottom line. In fact, what we're doing is shifting from an extractive economy to a generative economy. It is as fundamental a change as the Industrial Revolution was in the first place. So when I talk about a livable future, I'm not talking about wishful thinking. I'm talking about something that can come right out of good old business know-how, along with caring about what happens. And we have a world full of younger people moving into it who want that kind of good business. Now, there's still a challenge. There's also still bad business out there. It is heavily invested. It has a lot of power. There's a lot of political work still to be done. There will be major pushback in this, and that is where citizen action, citizen leadership, and our willingness to have inside-outside partnerships with champions of change inside professions and those outside pushing them. The folks inside know what sorts of changes are needed. The ones on the outside can put the pressure on. I have a handout how professionals in the private sector can contribute to a livable future, bearing in mind every profession is part of the problem and every profession is part of the solution. The new innovations are at the margins. They're already proven. We know how to do things better. The question is how to bring them into the center. And that's where the kinds of partnerships and financing we've been talking about this evening matters. On the other hand, even where not publicly acknowledged, the pressure of we the people is moving the future. You'll see on the slide, I've got the royalty up there waving their hands. That's not going to happen. The powers that be don't show up on a balcony and say, great job, guys, you're forcing us to change. But everything I have studied behind the scenes, it's not just triple bottom line, it's triple threat. It used to be when you talked about risk factors and planning for the future, you were just talking about things like stock markets and maybe you'd have more or fewer sales. Now it's, okay, what about carbon? What about weather? What about people showing up in the street? What about our shareholder revolt? Pressure from all sides is forcing businesses both to ask questions they didn't have to ask before and see opportunities for making a difference that they didn't see before. And looking at where is bad business getting in the way, we can find the places where we need not just investment, we need new rules. We need an even playing field. The socially responsible companies do not need to be up against the handful of companies that get away right now. They get away with murder, quite literally. We need to put bad business out of business. We need to outlaw ethical failures and turn it into criminal failures that can be prosecuted. In fact, one idea that has surfaced is a company that is engaged in what in effect are criminal acts. Okay, corporate personhood, put them in prison. Not literally prison. Pull their profits for 10 years. Put it in receivership. And if it's a capital crime, give them capital punishment. Shut down the corporation. When corporations were first started in this country, they only had a 20-year life. They were not immortal. No human being is immortal. So we have to take them literally, okay? You want to be treated like a person? We will be happy to oblige. In our show next time, we will be looking at how to change the rules, move the money and then change the rules. And we will at that point be talking a little more about public banking and about carbon fee and dividend and other ways of making companies pay the actual costs of doing business so that they're no longer in effect taking the resources that belong to all of us and putting it just in their own pockets. After you watch this Move the Money this evening, this program, you can go to our website. You'll get a lot more information, the links and resources for what we're doing. You can also find there our Citizen Action Field Manual, where these things are discussed in more depth and where we're looking at strategies to carry them out. We have discussion groups occurring both in Dayton, Ohio and Santa Cruz, California, strategic action circles. You can find our programming on YouTube and on Channel 27 in Santa Cruz and Channel 73 in Watsonville. I so much appreciate your being here this evening, watching this show. Thank you very much. And also to the crew, the volunteer crew here that has made all of this possible this evening. Thank you.